I'm about to show you many things to attempt if your D-pad on your DualShock 4 controller is having an issue. Issues such as not registering a push on its own, being stuck, not bouncing back into position, or making an odd noise. Try the solutions I show you in the order that I show them because they kind of build on one another. The first several things don't involve taking things apart, but later on I'll have you going inside and doing things there. So keep going through each solution until your problem is resolved or until you reach the end of your comfort level with working with an electronic device. For many of you, this first thing will fix your issue. Grab some thin cardboard from like any kind of product you have in your home and cut it into a wedge. And then stick that wedge into the gap around whatever button is giving you the issue and move it around. The idea here is to scrape away any residue that has built up on the inside. Sometimes that interferes with the proper movement of the D-pad. If the corner on your wedge starts to get damaged, switch to another corner. You don't want pieces of cardboard getting inside your controller. After doing all this, check to see if that fixed the issue. If it didn't, move on to solution 2. This time you're going to apply suction to the gap using a vacuum cleaner nozzle, assuming you own a vacuum cleaner that has one. Press on the D-pad in various directions as you do this. Full suction might be a little bit too much, so if you have the ability to turn the suction down on your vacuum cleaner, go ahead and do that. This is a good follow-up to the first solution because you may have scraped some residue off and it might be loose and laying inside there right now. Solution 3 is the opposite of solution 2. This time you're going to blow into the gap. You can use a straw, you can use canned air, you can use a hairdryer as long as you have it on the cold setting. Some people like to put their whole mouth on the controller and just blow that way. I recommend the straw over all of these because it concentrates the air into one spot. This is also a good time to hit that like button if you're getting a lot out of this video. Thank you. This one is a long shot, but I wanted to put it in here because this is the last thing you can try before going inside the controller. There's a little hole on the back. At the end of that hole is a button, and if you stick something in there and hold that button for 5 seconds, it resets the controller. I'm using a little tiny nail, but if you have a needle or something like that, it'll also work. By the way, if your controller has a dead battery, this will not work. So make sure it's charged at least a little bit. Now in doing this, your controller may forget what it was previously connected to, so you may have to do the pairing process all over again. If nothing has worked so far, the next step is to go inside and attempt various things like cleaning and replacing parts. Be warned though, anytime you go inside a compact electronic device, there is some risk of breaking something, or you may just make your problem worse. I will say I'm going to do my best to be very detailed and show you all the things I've learned over the years to minimize that risk. Also note that they made these DualShock 4s over a series of many years, and during that time they made different revisions of the board, so along the way I'm going to point out some of those differences when it's important enough to mention. Just like every controller on the planet pretty much, the DualShock has 2 halves. And the first step is to separate those 2 halves. It's going to make your life a lot easier if you scrape out any gunk that has accumulated in the gap between those halves. That gunk can kind of act like a glue and make it hard to pull them apart. So just take any kind of small sharp instrument and run it along the fault line there. Same goes with the screws. Clean up any crud that has accumulated around them. Here's the 4 spots where the outside screws are. Remove them with a small Phillips screwdriver. This is the size of the bit that I used. If one of the screws still doesn't want to budge, try dropping 1 drop of water on it, let it soak for a minute, and then wipe the water back out. And also tap on the screw. Next, you need to separate the two shells, but hold on for a second while I point some things out. There's plastic tabs that keep the two sides together. For some people, these tabs will feel very tight, and in some cases, they may break as you pull the two halves apart. If they do, I recommend you don't worry about it, because those tabs are really redundant. Your controller will still go back together just fine. In fact, a while back, I did an experiment where I broke off every tab intentionally, and I was still able to put my controller back together because the 4 screws hold it back together just fine. If you do break one of those tabs, make sure you don't leave the pieces of it inside the controller, just turn it over and shake it out. Also note, there's a ribbon cable that connects the two halves, so you don't want to yank them too far apart and snap that cable. Later on, we're going to unplug that cable. Another thing I want to point out is, for some of you, part of the shell goes in between the top buttons like this. If so, take special care not to pull it in a way that rips off the L2 and R2 buttons. If they do come off though, they can just snap back into place. And the final tip I'll give you is to try to make sure the buttons are facing down when you're separating. Otherwise, the battery might fall out. So start separating the two halves. The best place to start is in the handles where the two pieces come together. Try to do it by hand at first, but if it doesn't budge, try a prying tool if you have one around. When you get some separation, start applying more force, and it'll eventually just snap apart. Next, you'll need to disconnect the ribbon cable that connects the two halves. The best way to get the ribbon out is to pull on the little blue part. Don't pull it at an angle, pull it straight up. When you do get it out, try to remember which way the metal contacts were facing so that you can put it back in the right way when you put it back together. Lay the lower half aside and keep the buttons facing downward. Some of you have a loose reset button that may have fallen out during this process, or it may eventually fall out. If so, just lay it aside. Next, move the battery out of the way to expose the screw that's underneath. I used to tell people to disconnect the battery, but the connector can be very tight, and by removing it, you risk pulling the whole connector off the board. And if that happens, you have a pretty big problem. So we're just gonna keep the battery off to the side throughout this whole video. Unscrew that screw that's under the battery holder, then remove the holder itself. For some of you, it'll come right off. For others, it's snapped into place with pegs, and those pegs can be very tight. Try to remove it with your fingers, but if you can't, stick something in there and just pry it out. Next, disconnect this ribbon cable. Some of you will have a gate that needs to be opened before you can pull it out. If you have any other screws on your circuit board, go ahead and remove them at this time. Now lay the battery back onto the board where the holder was. Keep the buttons facing down, but push up on the analog sticks. This will separate the lower shell. Some of you will have a slot for this ribbon cable, and you'll have to feed it through that slot as you separate it, or else it might get snagged and rip off. We are now positioned to start working directly with the D-pad. Start with the rubber padding that is over top of it. Remove it from the pegs that are holding it. It's likely got a lot of dust on it. Take it to the sink and clean it, and then dry it off before you do anything else with it. A lot of times we would clean things with alcohol, but I would not recommend putting alcohol on this rubber padding because it might damage the material. That's why we're using good old-fashioned water. Next, inspect that padding to see if it's damaged. Look for a tiny little tear to it. Push up on each of the nubs and make sure they're still reflexive. And as you're pushing on them, look for more small tears. Make sure the black contact material on the end of those nubs isn't worn away. If the material looks to be in bad shape, order a replacement. I'll have some affiliate links to some in the description, or you can just take the padding from another controller you might have laying around. Next, remove the D-pad. Give it a very good cleaning with water or alcohol. Also, inspect it to see if any part of it is broken or worn out. All these things can be replaced, and like I said before, I'll put links in the description. Next, clean the holes where the D-pad was sitting. Then turn your attention to the conductive film that's sitting on the other part of the controller. Dust everything off and clean each of the contact points with a little bit of alcohol. This film can also be replaced if it appears to be damaged. I'll show you how to remove it, but before you start doing that, just make sure you have a replacement lined up. For some people, it's one big piece. For others, it's two different pieces, and you may just need one of those two pieces. This film goes all over the place, so in order to remove it, we have to remove some of the other components. We're going to start by removing the 4 buttons that are on top of the controller, R1, R2, and L1 and L2. Removing the L1 and R1 buttons is a 2-step process, at least for the kind I have. You first have to pull it up like this, and then yank it all the way out. For everyone else though, removing that button is rather easy. For some of you, your R2 and L2 buttons have a tail on them that goes down like this. In that case, you can unsnap the button by pulling up on one side of it and then the other. You just kind of do a rocking motion. If it doesn't have the tail, it's a lot easier. It just comes straight off. Be on the lookout for a spring. It might come off and land beside you. If it does, just set it aside for now. Now I need to remove the rubber padding that was underneath those buttons and just set it aside. From there, you have access to start removing the film. Next, we need to pop this board out of place. On my version, it's held on by multiple tabs, so I can just push on those tabs and the board will come loose. You don't need to actually remove the board, you can just move it out of position a little bit. You can see that the film is coming through a slot and it's attached to 2 pegs, so remove it from those 2 pegs and feed it through the hole. With that board pulled out, you can check the version of it, and you can use that ID as part of your search for the replacement parts. So that's all the fixes I have to suggest. For the rest of the video, I'm just going to show you how to put the controller back together. Push the board back into the tabs that hold it. Put the padding back into place, with the pointy end going in first. Put the R1 and L1 back into place. Put the L2 and R2 buttons back on. If you had the kind with the tails, they should snap right back into place easily. If you had the smaller kind without the tails, it's a little bit more challenging. There is a spring involved that may have fallen out. I'm going to assume the worst and tell you how to put that spring back in and place the button back into place. This upcoming segment is from an older video, so my voice may sound a little bit different. Tilt the button upside down so that you have the little pegs at the top. If it's R2, place the spring over the peg that's on the left, like so. If it's L2, put it on the right side peg. Don't do it this way. There's a little slot under that peg. One leg of the spring needs to go into that slot. It doesn't snap into it, it just kind of lays there loosely. Flip the button like this. There's a tiny slot on the controller side that the other leg of the spring fits into. Bring the controller up to it like this. You may need to hold the battery in place as you do this. Land the leg into the slot and snap the button into place. Put the D-pad back into place. Put the rubber padding back onto the pegs. There is no up or down, you can just spin it however you want. Just make sure it's securely on the pegs. And make sure the black contacts are facing up. Place the inside frame back into place. Some of you will have to feed this ribbon cable through a little slot. Insert that ribbon cable back into its connector. Some of you have a gate that needs to be open when you stick it in, and once it's in, you shut the gate. Bear in mind that this connector leads to the touchpad. In the end, if the touchpad is not working, go back in and just check the way you plugged this ribbon in. Put the battery holder back on. Some of you will need to snap it into place. For everyone else, it just kind of lays there on top of the board. Put the screw back into place. Make sure you get it all the way in because it basically holds the whole thing together. Some of you will have a loose reset button that may have come out. Drop it back into place. Put the battery back into the holder and make sure the QR code on the battery is facing upward. There's a little bit of a hook that you can wrap the battery wires into. Take the other half of the shell and stick the ribbon cable that's on it into the connector that's on the other half. This is very tricky to do, and it's also where a lot of people make a mistake. There's metal contacts on one side of the ribbon, and they need to face a certain way, and for some of you, it's away from the battery, and for others, it's toward the battery. And it depends on what revision you have. If your connector is 100% vertical like this one, the metal contacts need to be facing the battery. If your connector is tilted like this one, the contacts should face away from the battery. By the way, this cable powers the light and the charging port, so if those things aren't functioning when this is all put together, come back and make sure that this cable is secure and facing the right direction. Place the two halves back together, they just kind of snap into place, and then put these 4 screws back into place. And that's all I had for you. I hope you found the video helpful. If you did, please hit that like button. I'll see you around.